This story took place in 1974 and turned out to be one of the most high-profile and convoluted in U.S. criminal history. Both local organizations and FBI specialists were involved in the investigation of this case. A well-known incarcerated murderer admitted to committing this crime. Even the famous boss of the Irish mafia was suspected. However, perhaps the culprit was much closer than many thought. In order to identify the victim, her body was exhumed 3 times over different years. Even Stephen King's son, writer Joe Hill, tried to help the investigation, but the identification of the victim remained unsuccessful for almost 50 years. Only on October 31, 2022, it was announced who the famous Lady of the Dunes really was. Subscribe to this channel and don't forget to click the bell to get notifications about new videos. Provincetown, Barnstable County, Massachusetts, July 26, 1974. Here, in the dunes of Race Point, a 12-year-old girl was walking with her dog. At one moment, the pet's attention was drawn to something, and it ran ahead barking. The owner followed him and initially thought she was seeing a dead deer, but when she got closer, she was confronted with a horrific scene. Arriving law enforcement officers found the naked body of a woman. Both of her hands and one forearm were missing. The body was lying face down on half of a beach blanket. The head was severely battered on the left side and rested on a blue bandana and Wrangler jeans, with a hair tie threaded with golden filament in her hair. No other belongings were found, nor was the murder weapon. However, footprints of 2 individuals were found, starting 50 yards from the body and leading away from tire tracks in the sand. The body itself was located in the dunes, about a mile east of the Race Point Ranger Station. The deceased's age was estimated to be between 25 and 40 years old, but it was noted that she might have been even younger than 20. Later, the range was extended to 50 years old. The victim's height was initially determined to be 5 feet 8 inches, but later, it was considered to be more likely 5 feet 6 inches. Her weight was determined to be 145 pounds. Her hair was chestnut or reddish in color and was tied back with a rubber band into a small ponytail. The girl had undergone expensive dental work while alive. Specifically, she had dental crowns worth between $5,000 to $10,000. The technique used was referred to as the New York style by specialists. Some of her teeth were removed, most likely by the killer with the same intent as he had in removing her hands, to complicate the identification process. Clearly, for the same reason, he tried to decapitate her, but he failed. Signs of sexual abuse were also noted, likely committed post-mortem. Despite the presence of signs of strangulation on the body, the coroners determined the cause of death to be head injuries. It was noted that judging by the angle at which the blows were struck, the victim was lying down, possibly asleep, and the perpetrator was likely lying next to her. This happened approximately 2 weeks before the body was found. The police did extensive work trying to learn anything about the victim's identity, but all their efforts did not yield positive results. In the end, the murdered woman was buried in the St. Peter's Cemetery near the center of Provincetown, with an inscription on a small gravestone, "Unidentified female body found in Race Point Dunes, July 26, 1974. At that time, the unidentified deceased woman started being referred to as the Lady of the Dunes. Young girls often go missing for various reasons. Some of them become victims of crimes. Others run away on their own, deciding to start life afresh. This has happened throughout history, and the 70s were no exception. Consequently, the police had to look into many cases of missing women, and some of them caught the detectives' special attention. Vicki Lee Lamberton. By February 1974, Vicki Lamberton was studying psychology at Assumption College in Worcester, Massachusetts. Not long before that, she had broken up with her husband and moved out. She was assisted in her move by a psychology professor from her own school, Dr. Roger Barker. It was believed that the girl was having an affair with the teacher. Still, a month and a half after the breakup, Lamberton called her husband and discussed the possibility of resuming their relationship. But first, she said, she wanted to go with a friend to Maine for the weekend. She was never heard from again after that. When her husband contacted the friend Vicki was supposed to travel with, it turned out she knew nothing about the trip. However, another friend was found, to whom the missing woman had said she planned to go to Colorado with the professor. At the same time, the college management confirmed that Dr. Barker was indeed in Colorado, but he had fallen ill with pneumonia during a ski outing and was in the hospital, so he would return a couple of weeks later. Also, Vicki's belongings were found in the professor's garage. The college was only 160 miles from where the Lady of the Dunes was found. The 24-year-old woman closely resembled the murder victim in appearance, although she was somewhat shorter and slimmer than the deceased. What happened to Vicki and whether she is still alive is unknown, but she was not the only person of interest for the police in this case. Frances Collier Ewald. Forsyth, Montana, August 19, 1973. In this town, at a bar named Agate, two friends were spending time together. Around 11 p.m., one of them decided to leave, saying she was going to visit her brother, who was working as a musician in a nightclub. That girl was Frances Collier Ewald. Since then, no one has seen her again. Frances was 24 years old, and she worked as a waitress at the local Century Club bar. Despite her young age, she was already a mother of 3 children. At the time of her disappearance, she was in the process of getting a divorce from her husband. The missing woman's family didn't believe she could have simply run away, as it was uncharacteristic of her. Plus, she didn't take any belongings with her, left her paycheck, and even her car. Moreover, Frances had money in a trust fund set up for her by her grandfather, but she never attempted to use them, nor the money in her other bank accounts. In an effort to find out something about her daughter's disappearance, her mother even offered a reward of $500 to anyone who could provide any information about her, but the reward remained unpaid. The investigation initiated by Rosebud County Sheriff James Schiffer yielded no results. However, a theory emerged that Frances might have been the woman found in Provincetown, the so-called Lady of the Dunes. The description of the murdered woman closely matched that of the presumed runaway Ewald. Despite the considerable distance between Forsyth and the dunes in Massachusetts, almost a year had passed since the disappearance, and the girl could have traveled that distance. But it was almost 50 years before it was confirmed whether Ewald was indeed the murder victim. Her father, Leo Roy Collier, passed away in 2003. Her mother, Marion Fay Collier, passed the following year. They never found out about their daughter's fate, but they believed she had been killed and thrown into the Yellowstone River, which was essentially on the edge of their hometown of Forsyth. Meanwhile, investigators continued their efforts to establish the identity of the Lady of the Dunes, using other methods. 5 years after the discovery of the murdered woman in 1979, a clay reconstruction of her head was created with the aim of identifying the deceased. A year later, the body was exhumed, and attempts were made to uncover any previously overlooked circumstances of death, but to no avail. The body was reburied, leaving the skull for further examinations and potential reconstructions of the victim's appearance. It was this that allowed the investigation to take a new turn. James Joseph Bulger. James Bulger, better known as Whitey, earned this nickname from the police due to his light hair color, began committing crimes at 14, frequently ending up behind bars. This, however, didn't prevent him from enlisting in the U.S. Army, serving there for about 4 years, facing many disciplinary actions, but still honorably discharged. Nevertheless, this didn't set him on a path of reformation, and he spent about 9 years in various correctional facilities, including the infamous Alcatraz Island prison. At that time, he, like some other convicts, accepted an offer to participate in a special CIA program called MK Ultra in exchange for sentence mitigation. The criminals were told that they would receive experimental treatment made to combat schizophrenia. In fact, Bulger and others were given LSD and other drugs for 18 months with the aim of studying the mind's ability to self-control under the influence of potent substances. Obviously, this significantly negatively affected the psyche of James, who was already prone to violence. "It brought me to the depths of insanity," Whitey described his feelings in his notebook. He also began hearing voices and was afraid to admit this to anyone. Upon release from prison, James worked as a cleaner and construction worker, but a modest life was not part of the former truck robber's plans. In the end, he joined experienced bandits, and engaged in all the usual gangster activities of that time, including robberies, usury, illegal gambling, and murders. A little later, he joined the Winter Hill Gang located in the namesake Boston suburb, and in 1965, after the murder of James Buddy McLean, he took over it. Upon receiving information about an impending arrest, Bulger fled, soon becoming the FBI's most wanted criminal after Osama bin Laden. However, it took 16 years to catch him in 2011. The 81-year-old killer was arrested alongside his girlfriend, Catherine Grieg, in a small apartment they were renting for $1,145 a month. However, the couple had over $800,000 in cash and more than 30 firearms with them. Bulger's trail was picked up thanks to search ads for his girlfriend, which were distributed in beauty salons and plastic surgery clinics. The reward of $2 million was received by Anna Bjornsdottir, a designer and yoga instructor who recognized Greg. Bjornsdottir had won the title of Miss Iceland in 1974, the same year the mutilated body of Lady Doon was found. In prison, Bulger consistently violated regulations, behaved indecently towards guards, and even made death threats. Because of this, he was transferred to other correctional facilities. The last time, on October 29, 2018, he was transferred to the Hazleton State Prison in West Virginia. Just 12 hours later, the 89-year-old former gangster was killed in his cell. By this point, Bulger couldn't walk due to a painful hip. Criminals took advantage of this and wheeled him in a wheelchair to a place not covered by surveillance cameras. They then beat Whitey with a padlock placed in a sock and other terrible things. In 2022, Fotios Gaius and 2 of his accomplices were charged with the murder of the former boss of the Irish mafia. Gaius was known for serving a life sentence for the murder of Adolfo Big Al Bruno, a major member of the famous Genovese mafia family, which he committed together with his brother. Most likely, Bulger was killed because he had been an FBI informant for many years, a theory that is confirmed by the method of his murder. And 40 years prior, in 1981, during the investigation of the murder of the so-called Lady of the Dunes, police came across a woman who claimed that in 1974 she saw Whitey with a girl very similar to the unidentified one. Considering that the gang led by Bulger was based in the Winter Hill area, just 120 miles from the place where the body was found, it was quite possible. Moreover, the gang leader was known for his poor attitude towards women, their murders, and even more so, he removed the teeth from his victims. It is believed that he killed at least 11 people. It was not possible to establish or refute a connection between the murdered woman and Bulger. But he was not the only known criminal who could be responsible for the death of that young woman. Hadden Irving Clark. Hadden Clark was born in 1952 in the town of Troy, New York. He was the second of 4 children in the family, and his childhood, to put it mildly, was unhappy. His parents were alcoholics, so arguments and fights were common in the Clark family. Sometimes his drunken mother dressed Hadden in women's clothes, causing the child to see himself as a girl. He carried this habit into adulthood. Hadden's father committed suicide, and 2 of his brothers were convicted of murder and domestic violence. As a child, Hadden himself tortured animals and other children. As an adult, he trained as a cook and worked in restaurants and even on cruise liners. But obvious mental disorders were the reason for constant dismissals. He even served in the Navy, but was also discharged from there after being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. A characteristic behavior for the man after getting fired was to take revenge on his former employers. He could damage their property or rob them. This trait led Hadden to murder. On May 31, 1986, Hadden's brother demanded that he leave his home in Silver Spring, Maryland. Shortly after, their 6-year-old neighbor, Michelle Dorr, came over to invite Hadden's niece for a walk. Clark killed her, carried her body out in a bag, and buried it 12 miles from the city. His next known murder took place 6 years later, on October 18, 1992, in Bethesda, Maryland. Clark was working as a gardener for a woman named Penny. One day, he was accused of stealing tools. He then snuck into the bedroom of the homeowner's 23-year-old daughter, Laura Hodeling, whom he killed with a knife and a pillow. But the killer made a mistake, leaving his fingerprint behind. Already in prison in 2004, the criminal confessed to the murder of Lady of the Dunes in a letter to his friend. Moreover, he sent 2 drawings, one of which depicted a woman without hands, lying on her stomach, and the second was a map indicating the place where the body was found. He also confessed that certain pieces of evidence related to this case were located on his grandfather's property. Given Clark's mental health problems, the police were skeptical about his confessions, but still conducted a search at the indicated location. They found a plastic bucket with 200 pieces of jewelry, among which was a ring belonging to the girl killed by Hadden. It's likely that Clark had many more victims than the 2 known, but his connection with the murder found in Provincetown could not be established. Considering that the Lady of the Dunes case had gained considerable publicity, the detectives received many calls from people wishing to assist the investigation. Some recognized their missing relatives or acquaintances in the clay reconstruction of the face. In 1987, a woman from Canada contacted the police, claiming that a friend had told her about an incident that had occurred 15 years prior. Allegedly, her father had strangled some woman in the state of Massachusetts. However, these testimonies led to nothing. By the year 2000, DNA profile comparison had become widely used in forensics, and the body of the Provincetown Jane Doe was exhumed once again to obtain the necessary material for investigation. It was made because the detectives believed they knew the identity of the girl who was killed in 1974. Rory Jean Kessinger. Rory Kessinger was raised in a well-off family. Notably, when she was 20, her father held the position of security head at Myers Brothers Incorporated. Interestingly, in 1969, he wrote to the publisher of the Daily Illinois State Journal about how to influence youth to combat crime in their midst. By that time, his own daughter had run away from home 5 years earlier, joined a gang, used illicit substances, and engaged in drug and arms trafficking. In January 1973, Pembroke Police Lieutenant Willard Bulger was assisting colleagues from neighboring Stoughton with distributing traffic violation warnings. When he knocked on one of the doors, several people, including a girl dressed only in her underwear, jumped out of the house window. Bulger chased them and caught the girl who stumbled. She claimed she had been raped, but when they entered the house, she tried to snatch Bulger's pistol. The policeman pushed her away and began calling the station to summon colleagues. At that moment, the girl turned off the lights and ran into the next room. When the lieutenant followed her in, she said, "I'm sorry, but I have to kill you," and tried to shoot him with another pistol. However, the man prevented her from doing so, knocking the girl off her feet. This incident served as the basis for Kessinger's next crime. The woman required medical attention and was taken to the hospital. Since her underwear had been torn and removed in the struggle with Bulger, the nurses gave her a robe. When she was dressed, detectives began asking questions about what had happened and asked her to demonstrate exactly how she had tried to take Bulger's pistol. The girl readily agreed, and during the investigative experiment, she seized the gun of another police officer and tried to kill him, shouting, "Die, you damn pig!" But she was stopped this time as well. As a result, Rory was charged with 2 attempted murders of police officers. Before the trial, she was placed in the Plymouth County Correctional Facility. The inmates' regime there is considered medium security. This may explain the events that took place there on the night of May 26 to 27, 1973. An unknown person, likely a guard, handed Kessinger metal saw blades, which she used to saw through the bars on her window and escape from prison. After that, no one ever saw her again. She was 24 years old at the time of her disappearance. "Someone must have been waiting for her nearby in a car," said local Sheriff Peter Foreman. "She was never seen again, but the memories of her are indelible. In the old prison, you can still see the marks on the bars where she cut a hole." In 1999, FBI specialists concluded that Rory was most likely the very Lady of the Dunes. For this, they took a DNA sample from Rory's mother to compare it with the profile of the victim, but the result was indefinite, so they had to exhume the body of the unidentified woman to obtain higher quality samples. In 2002, it was definitively established that the victim was not Rory Jean. Rumors circulated that Kessinger was killed by her own accomplices, who didn't want a witness being sought by the police. One of the captured gang members also held this belief. However, what exactly happened to the escaped criminal remains unknown to this day. In 2013, the body of the Lady of the Dunes was exhumed again, but this also did not provide new evidence. However, the rusted thin metal coffin was replaced with a new one, and 2 years later, the story of the deceased took a very unexpected turn. Joseph Hillstrom King. In August 2015, Stephen King's son, also a writer, Joe Hill, became involved in the investigation of a girl's murder in Provincetown. Not long before this, the man read a book, The Skeleton Crew: How Amateur Sleuths Are Solving America's Coldest Cases. Then he became interested in the Lady of the Dunes case, and shortly after that, he noticed a scene from Steven Spielberg's popular 1975 film, Jaws. Hill noticed that during a beach celebration scene, a young girl appears on screen, matching the description of the victim. Moreover, she was wearing a blue bandana and jeans similar to those found under the victim's head. It turned out that the film was shot from May to October 1974 on Martha's Vineyard, in the village of Menemsha, just 100 miles south of Provincetown. Moreover, all the extras for the film were either local residents or those who came there on vacation. The main investigator in the case considered this theory, but it didn't help unravel the mystery of the girl's identity. Only 7 years later, the famous genealogical company Othram took the remains for modern DNA material research, which helped to find many close relatives of the unidentified woman. Finally, on October 31, 2022, representatives of the FBI office in Boston announced the true identity of the Lady of the Dunes. Ruth Marie Terry was born in a hut on the mountainside of Whitwell, Marion County, Tennessee, on September 8, 1936. Her mother, Eva, died at the age of 23, and the girl was left with her father, Johnny. At 20, Ruth married Billy Ray Smith, but the marriage didn't last long, and after a year, she moved to Livonia, Michigan, and got a job at the Fisher Body Car Factory. A year later, she gave birth to a son whom she named Richard, but was unable to raise him due to financial reasons. That's when her boss, Richard Hanchett Sr., offered to adopt the child in exchange for paying off her debts. Once the adoption process was completed, Ruth moved to California, where she also used the names Terry Marie Vizina and Terry Shannon. 14 years later, Terry contacted her former boss with the intention of meeting her son. However, at that very time, Richard was in a coma due to a drug overdose and remained in that state for 18 days. 2 years later, on February 16, 1974, in Reno, Nevada, 37-year-old Ruth married a 50-year-old antiques dealer, Guy Muldavan. Guy Rockwell Muldavan. Guy Muldavan was adopted by Abram Albert Zadworansky Muldavan and Sylvia Silverblatt. In 1942, at the age of 19, he studied at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. He avoided service in World War II as he was diagnosed with skull osteomyelitis. In 1946, the young man was 23 years old. In Bellevue, Pennsylvania, he married Joellen May Loop, with whom he lived for 10 years. But after 4 years of living together, Muldavan became the prime suspect in the murder of one person and the kidnapping of another. Henry Lawrence Baird, a 28-year-old bread delivery driver, lived in Eureka, California. His girlfriend, 17-year-old Barbara Jo Kelly, lived in the same Humboldt County, only in the town of Fortuna. On the evening of June 17, 1950, the young people went to the Table Bluff Beach. The next morning, Henry's body, only in socks and shoes, was found face down not far from the beach. He had been shot in the back of the head. The girl's clothes, with the exception of stockings and shoes, were neatly folded and laid under the guy's things. Barbara herself was never seen by anyone again. The family of Muldavan's first wife owned one of the 2 bars in Fortuna, and he worked there as a cook. The missing girl worked at the second bar, and Henry delivered bread to each of them. The investigation believed that it was Muldavan who killed the young people, but there wasn't enough evidence against him, so nothing could be proved. 2 years after the divorce, in 1958 in Idaho, Muldavan married Manzanita Eileen Ryan. His wife already had an 18-year-old daughter from a previous marriage, Dolores Ann Mearns. The couple's married life turned out to be short. On April 1, 1960, Menzie and her daughter disappeared. Police called the head of the family in for questioning, but he did not show up. Moreover, the man left Seattle, where their family had lived before. The escape didn't last long. A few months later, he was arrested by the FBI. But no connections between Muldavan and the disappearance of the women could be established. Moreover, it is alleged that parts of human bodies without heads and hands were found in the septic tank of his house. However, because detectives could not determine whom they belonged to and how they got there, the King County prosecutor did not press charges against Guy. While FBI agents were looking for Muldavan, he managed to get married for the third time. Shortly after his wedding to Evelyn Mary Emerson, the man was accused of fraudulently extracting $10,000 from his new wife's relatives. However, the judge agreed to postpone the punishment on the condition that the convicted man return the stolen money. In 1974, Ruth Marie Terry, Lady of the Dunes, became Muldavan's next wife. Just 4 months before her death, the couple visited the woman's family in her hometown. As her niece, Brittany Novoglonsky, said, "Relatives noticed that Ruth was not herself when her husband was around. Moreover, Guy behaved as if his wife was his property." Afterwards, the couple visited Ruth's stepbrother Kenneth and his wife Carol in Chattanooga, Tennessee. As Kenneth and Carol Terry remembered, the two said they were traveling around the country in search of antiques. They also talked about their plans to go to Massachusetts. What surprised the relatives was when, in late summer 1974, Guy returned to Tennessee, stayed for a very short time, and informed them that his wife had disappeared from their home in California. One of the girl's brothers, James, went to California and hired a private detective to search for his sister. After some time, the detective reported that all of Ruth's belongings had been sold, and that she had left her home voluntarily to join a religious cult. But most of the family members didn't believe this and considered Ruth Marie to be deceased, and they noted this in family obituaries. While we have identified Ruth as the victim of this horrendous murder, it doesn't take away the pain of her family. Nothing can do that, said Joseph Bonavolanta, a special agent from the FBI's Boston office, at a press conference. But, hopefully, it will answer some questions as we continue to search for her killer. This is undoubtedly a major breakthrough in the investigation, which I hope will bring us closer to identifying the murderer. The FBI has also reached out to the public to gather as much information as possible about Ruth's husband. It is noted that the man used different names throughout his life, including Raoul Guy Muldavan and Raoul Guy Rockwell. However, even if he was the killer, he got away with it. In 1975, he married Phyllis Roper, with whom he lived until his death in 2002 at the age of 78.